strikes on Syria.
American, British, and French warships and planes launching dozens of missiles targeting the Syrian regime's chemical weapons sites. Video from Syria. If you remember the strikes, they come just about 1 year after President Trump ordered a first round of strikes after another.
They talked about these strikes being aimed directly at chemical weapons capabilities, the facilities in Syria where they believe these chemical weapons have been made. The president talking about the images the world saw of the children who suffered in agony, some of them not surviving. More than 40 died in that attack, talking about mothers and daughters gasping for air, and said this was the work. These are the crimes of a monster. Overnight, airstrikes lighting up the Syrian sky. American, British, and French forces launching a joint strike offensive, destroying 3 targets. Explosions could be heard across the region. A coordinated cruise missile attack from sea and air.
A Syrian bomber drops its deadly payload over homes in a residential area near Damascus. Seconds later, the bombs explode, unleashing chaos on the streets and sending a plume of fire and smoke into the sky. The amateur footage, said to have been shot in the town of Yabrud, later shows the scene of devastation wrought by the airstrike, with homes and shops reduced to rubble. Whether it was intended or not, the target appears to have been a residential apartment block. For chemical weapons as well.
On December 19, 2018, United States President Donald Trump announced via Twitter that he would be finally withdrawing U.S. troops from Syria, something he made clear a long time ago that he was planning to do and had pledged to do. Trump never made that a secret. He wanted to do this long before this, but his advisors kept persuading him to wait and not to do it, basically indefinitely. But as time went on and the United States and its partners destroyed the ISIS caliphate, effectively, pretty much, and with a political solution remaining unattainable in the near term, the president's patience ended on this matter. The establishment media, both left and right, has had a meltdown because of it. The basic lines given are that though it's true that there are other ways to get positive outcomes in Syria using economic sanctions and diplomatic pressure, as the Trump administration has stated it is committed to doing, it will be much harder without the influence earned by an effective military presence. So the mantra goes on this matter. At this point, now December 23, 2018, it's not known yet when exactly the American military will pull out. A senior White House administrator told the Washington Times, not to be confused with the discredited Washington Post, but with the more center-right Washington Times, this, quote, "You'll hear different timelines bandied about. I just say take them with a grain of salt. Whether it's this month or next, December or January, politicians, pundits, and press believe that there are enormously consequential risks that come with withdrawal that the president's advisors warned him of, but the president did not find persuasive enough. It's never admitted that the main reason to stay in all these places is to serve weapons dealers and the military-industrial complex. That's the main reason. Real facts would tend to indicate. So other reasons are always given as front excuses that may or may not have any real validity. Many Republicans are simply war pigs, facts would tend to indicate, and has been admitted, and has been stated, and want an American military presence everywhere in the world to serve arms merchants of the world, special interests, and also to push an American machismo and overlordship, police the whole world, etc. This is not opinion, but decades of evidence and even some reluctant admissions by now have proved this to be a real fact that is not even really debatable. There are warmongers in the Republican and even Democrat Party. And there are lobbyists and special interests that push this nonstop, despite nuanced trolling by talking heads. But again, James Mattis is being removed as Secretary of Defense because he was one of these advisors who wanted to stay in Syria with the usual reasons given. And James Mattis has also been called a warmonger. Here are just three of the basic reasons that are constantly touted on CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, CBS, Washington Post, Washington Times, New York Times, The Guardian, the Los Angeles Times, etc., etc. First argument is that despite wiping out most of the 100,000 ISIS fighters, more than 10,000 ISIS fighters remain in Syria and could reestablish the caliphate. Because the entire cancer is not removed yet, just the vast majority, while some are still visibly fighting, many remain and are hiding in communities. They will be back. The hope is that the coalition the United States trained will be able to continue the fight and keep ISIS from reestablishing. History of their having success in this without U.S. help is not good, but nonetheless it will primarily be their responsibility, not America's. But the basic argument is that, quote, ISIS is on the rise in Syria. And this is said by the Pentagon and the State Department after they heard that Trump is pulling out. So the military-industrial complex goes to their mouthpieces in the mainstream media to do their bidding and propaganda warfare of why the U.S. military should remain in Syria because, quote, ISIS is on the rise and, quote, ISIS is still a threat. So also say Senator Lindsey Graham and Marco Rubio, of course, who still defend the Iraq War of W. Bush. Real facts sound harsh, but they're real facts nonetheless. And let it be known that Graham takes money from defense contractors, same with Rubio. So that's bound to color their views and their rhetoric on matters like this. Endless war, endless militarism, endless intervention, endless conflict in other regions of the world. And the real facts show that ISIS in Syria has been effectively defeated. And another real fact is that ISIS has been effectively defeated mainly by the Syrian government, not primarily by the U.S. But that fact will be denied or downplayed by the military-industrial complex of the United States of America, many anti-war commentators say, because the real reason is that they simply want an American military presence there regardless of ISIS, or regardless of Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. Second argument is that Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has threatened to attack the Kurds, the very people who have partnered with the United States, who have suffered enormous casualties in the war against ISIS, and their fate hangs in the balance. The SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, is a coalition of local Arab and Kurdish forces and led by Kurdish militia called the YPG, which stands for Yekeneyen Palestina Gel, which means, when translated, People's Protection Units, which Turkey considers a terrorist group. When the more conservative Washington Times asked about the fate of America's Kurdish partners, a senior U.S. official told the Washington Times that the United States, quote, appreciates that the U.S. is indebted to the Kurds, unquote, for what they have done in Syria. But the contention by the establishment war hawks is that the assurances of appreciation won't keep America's Kurdish friends from being slaughtered. And the Washington Times says that President Trump has rightly elevated the need for U.S. allies and partners to behave like allies and partners if they want benefits that only the United States can provide. The Kurds have been model partners, so it's been said. It is argued by the, quote, withdrawal is a mistake people that the United States should demonstrate to the world what that gets you, and that America cannot afford the answer to be abandoning them. And as all the establishment believe without question, despite the blatantly logical problems with the belief that Assad gassed babies, even though there's evidence to show that he actually didn't, the argument by the warmongering Washington Times is that without an empowered, not defanged, and definitely not eliminated YPG-led coalition, the United States will be, by default, leaving the anti-ISIS campaign to Bashar al-Assad and his cache of chemical weapons and barrel bombs. Again, the establishment narrative is accepted blindly without question, despite the flaws, problems, and difficulties with that narrative. Third reason given is that Iran and, of course, Russia stand to benefit for their investment in keeping the Syrian civil war prolonged and President Assad in power. And its activities in Syria will only expand once the United States leaves. Syria was a strategic ally of Iran long before the civil war broke out in 2014. But Iran has been exploiting the civil war by working toward establishing a contiguous land bridge to the Mediterranean Sea. And conservatives keep saying that this is not something that Israel has tolerated. As Foundation for Defense of Democracy's scholars penned this summer, quote, Israel seeks to prevent Iran from turning Syria into an active front, similar to what it has faced with Hezbollah in Lebanon since the 1980s, unquote. So conservatives worry that if the United States leaves Syria now, the danger to Israel dramatically elevates. But here is something more people in the national security expert community should grapple with. Despite the risks of a sudden and premature withdrawal, Mr. Trump likely will not face political blowback. This is because the U.S. engagement in Syria is overwhelmingly unpopular with the American people. There is war weariness and Middle East fatigue after years of interference and illegal invasion in Iraq and the ongoing nonsense in Afghanistan, and Trump has said he wants to leave Afghanistan too. Remember, engaging militarily in the Middle East much less is what Trump campaigned on in 2015 and 2016 to a large degree. He's only keeping campaign promises and stuff that he was elected on. And the establishment, with all their reasons, are like, quote, how dare he? The, quote, authorizations to use military force, AUMF, that President Bush sought and received from the Congress in 2001 and 2002 to go after Islamist militants that were supposedly responsible for the attacks on September 11, 2001, simply does not apply to the U.S. mission in Syria and elsewhere. That should tell you something. If the United States was going to keep a military presence in Syria longer, it would have been wise for the White House to seek an AUMF from Congress. This did not happen, in part because despite condemnations from some congressmen and senators about the president's decision to withdraw, Congress couldn't deliver an AUMF, authorizations to use military force. And so, even if staying in Syria longer with the objective to secure an environment more conducive to a lasting peace in the right policy decision, the American people, both lefties and righties and in-betweeners who are not in the media or in Congress, don't buy it. And ultimately, it's up to the American people, the American voters, in this complex and corrupt system and situation. And as far as actual withdrawing troops from a country, the decision is ultimately the president's, and the president alone. It was up to the president to work to persuade them of the worthiness of the mission or leave. He made his choice. But you see the confusion. First it was said, quote, there were just a few American advisors in Syria to help train some of the rebels and revolutionaries there, etc. Like maybe a few dozen or 100 or a couple of hundred at most. Then it was, okay, there are 2,000 American soldiers there in Syria. Never mind that. It's okay and necessary, they say. This is what is called mission creep. It turns out that there have been at least 4,000 American soldiers in Syria doing whatever. Is it to help the rebels there, who many are Islamic extremists and actually in sympathy with ISIS or are even ISIS? To, quote, overthrow Assad? Or is it to, quote, defeat ISIS, who Assad has also been fighting against? Or what about the, quote, moderate rebels that America has been backing? Well, the Daily Beast reported in 2016 that so-called, quote, moderate rebels beheaded a child near Aleppo. Real facts. Mentioned in some print media, but it was basically ignored by mainstream broadcast media. That even the so-called, quote, moderate rebels are monstrous murderers and maniacs and basically deranged thugs. Real facts. Not set up things by the, quote, white helmets rebels in Syria of supposed chemical gassing of kids by Assad, which never really happened that way, many experts say, when really looked at more carefully. Call them conspiracy theorists all you want. The establishment narrative and story on that just doesn't jibe. The point is that all of them are arguably bad and brutal. The world is a mess, and no decision is without problems. Not to get too theological or philosophical, but real facts would indicate that a higher power alone, if he exists, is what is needed to end the nightmares and quagmires and the madness. Not the UN, US, or intelligence communities, or armies or navies of corrupt and wonky governments. No matter what Trump does, no matter what America in general does, the Middle East and the world in general will remain a horrible and bloody mess. The facts indicate this.